Okay. All right, chapter 7. I made it back to the shelter that evening. The dark hole that had seemed so terrible the night before now made me feel safe again. I figured the outside world was just what Pap had warned me about. Everybody was out to get us, and hiding in the forest was the only way to stay safe. Loneliness was something I'd have to wait on to pass, like Pap said it would. I sat on the hide pile, and I put on my jacket and hat to warm up. Then I pulled some dried venison off a hindquarter that hung from the ceiling, and I chewed it slowly while I listened to the forest sounds. Figured I'd spend at least one more night before the law could get with the surveyors and track me to the shelter. It was too far and too dangerous to try it after dark, so they wouldn't start out until morning. The closest paved road was 3 miles to a bird. With all the gullies and swamps, though, not even I could travel that direction in less than half a day. What's 3 miles to a bird mean? You ever heard as the crow flies?
No.
Wyatt, I need you to close that.
As the crow flies.
As the crow flies. You guys know what that means?
No.
Okay, so rather than taking roads and paths and sidewalks, those things take longer, right? If you're a bird, you can skip all of that and just fly in a straight line. So if you hear somebody say 3 miles as the crow flies, chances are it's going to take you longer to get there, because in a straight line, it's 3 miles away, but you can't just walk in a straight line. You have to navigate sidewalks, and he was saying in the forest you have to navigate ditches and rivers and hills and all that. So even 3 miles as a crow flies, that's 3 miles away, or 3 miles as a bird. But if you're trying to walk that, it's going to take much, much longer. When I woke at daybreak, robins were scratching in the leaves. The blue jay complained from nearby. I lay still and listened to the forest for several minutes until I was sure I heard nothing unusual. When I was satisfied no one was outside, I slid off the hide pile and I got my rifle from the place I kept it in the ceiling. I grabbed some bullets out of the paint can and I poured them into the cheesecloth that I had tied together. Then I quickly gathered other things I thought might be useful for the trip and packed them all in the wheelbarrow. My rifle, bullets, traps, several hides, dried coon meat, every extra clothes, Pap's personal box, some rope, a cooking pot, and a hatchet. When I was done, I threw the rain tarp over everything and I used some twine to secure it. After one last look around, I stuck my deerskin hat on my head and I set out for the river. I take a trail we rarely used that went north to the high ridge off the Noxubee River, and then I cut west to the blacktop. It was a longer route, but the river bottom was open and free of brush, so I could move more easily, push the wheelbarrow, and see anyone that might be after me. Once I made it to the blacktop, I'd be at the bridge that crossed the river. I'd have to push my wheelbarrow over the bridge and then get back into the trees again on the other side. I thought about what Pap said, only traveling at night. And I reasoned it was more important for me to get off Mr. Wellington's property as fast as I could. So he's got a wheelbarrow full of supplies. Where's he taking that wheelbarrow? Where's he taking the wheelbarrow?
Down the river.
He's taking it to his.
He's taking it where?
He's taking it to the river.
Oh, he's
Not
got
to the river.
a lot farther to go than just the river.
He's taking it to a.
Where's he taking it? Where did Moon's dad tell him to go? Pap told him to go to Alaska, right? So it makes sense. He's got a wheelbarrow full of supplies. He's got his rifle. He's got his dried up coon meat. He's got, what else does he got? He's got a tarp. He's got cooking pans. He's got it all piled up in a wheelbarrow. And he's going to walk that wheelbarrow all the way from Alabama to Alaska. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes.
I think you're probably right. Between wrestling the wheelbarrow through the forest and resting, it took me close to 6 hours to get to the highway. Thank you. Besides the river bottom, I had to get through 2 sloughs, a thick cedar grove, a quarter-mile of swampy cane thicket. When I got to the blacktop, I stayed just inside the trees and I laid down to rest. I felt my legs throbbing and watched my stomach move up and down. A breeze chilled my forehead where the sweat clung to my bangs. I reached over and pulled some coon meat from beneath the tarp. You guys know what coon meat is?
Yes.
So imagine a raccoon and you dry it out like beef jerky, except it's not beef, it's raccoon.
Yeah, all you basically.
I'm getting hungry. I reached over and pulled some coon meat from beneath the tarp. I lay back and chewed it slowly. I wanted to close my eyes, but I knew there was no time to sleep. Then I heard a car whoosh by, and it reminded me to get on my way again. I stood ready in the trees and I listened and watched the road. When I thought it was safe, I pushed out and up on top of the blacktop and started running behind the wheelbarrow. I'd never been on that bridge before. I'd only seen it from upriver. It was longer and higher than I thought, and I felt myself growing a little dizzy. The solid rubber tire of the wheelbarrow hummed across the asphalt, and far below the water swirled and passed underneath me. The air was much colder coming down the river, but with the panic that was rising in me, I hardly noticed. When I heard the car, I didn't turn around to look. I pushed my legs to go even faster, and I felt my neck hairs rise with fear. The end of the bridge was only 30 yards away, but if it was the law, I needed time to escape into the forest with my wheelbarrow at the other side, and that seemed impossible. I heard the car speeding up just as I came to the end of the bridge, and then my breath almost left me when I saw what I was up against. The road dropped off steeply to a swamp on both sides. There was nowhere to go. I stopped for the wheelbarrow. I spun around and spread my legs for the balance like Pap had shown me to do when I was about to fight. I recognized the police car from pictures. It had a light on top and a badge painted on the door. It skidded to a stop in front of me, and I watched the constable watching me and putting on his hat inside the car. When he stepped out, I could see he was taller and heavier than Pat. He wore his clothes tight, moved with his chest out, so it reminded me of a flared turkey. He nodded at me from behind dark sunglasses, and then looked over at the wheelbarrow. "What you got there, boy?" "Living stuff." He stared at the rifle barrel sticking out of the tarpaulin. "Are you doing some hunting?" I shook my head. "No, sir." "What you doing with that rifle?" "It's mine." "And what's that on your head?" "It's my hat." "Did you make it?" "Yes, sir, out of deerskin." He walked to the wheelbarrow and lifted a corner of the tarpaulin. He set it back down. "You that Blake boy?" I didn't answer. "You're him, ain't you?" I looked quickly at the gully behind me. I glanced down at my rifle. "Don't you try it," he said, like he knew what I was thinking. "I'll be all over you before you know it. I'm not doing anything to anybody." "Well, you better stop bowing up at me. Come over here and get in this car." I glanced over at the rifle. Suddenly, the constable stepped toward me. "Boy, you look at that rifle again, I'm going to knock you sideways." I swallowed hard. "Damned if you ain't the mean little cuss I thought you were." I looked at his holster and the giant chrome pistol that was stuffed into it. I thought about how long it would take him to pull it out and shoot me. A second later, I spun around and leaped out into the air. I hit the ground about halfway down the slope, and I rolled the rest of the way down to the bottom and splashed into the shallow water of the swamp. When I tried to stand, my feet punched into the soft mud. I tripped and landed face first. Then the constable crashed up against me, and I heard him grunt. I quickly got to my knees, and I started to crawl, but I felt him grab a hold of my ankle and hold it as I pulled handfuls of weed and muck. Suddenly, I slipped free. I scampered almost 5 feet before I heard him splat in the mud behind me, and I felt my ankle grip again. "You little turd," he yelled. I looked over my shoulder, and I saw him lying in his stomach. His sunglasses were gone, and his face was red and twisted with frustration as he slapped at me and pulled his boots from the mud. I made the last desperate leap to get away, but I wasn't able to break his hold. I sat up and kicked his hand, and he rolled over, cursing me like someone doing the backstroke. He threw his free arm into the air and down into the mud and grabbed my other foot. I twisted and rolled like an alligator, but it did no good. He pulled me toward him in little jerks. "Don't you jerk. Make me jerk. Have to jerk. Shoot your tail, boy." And he sat up and pulled me into his lap. "Boy!" I punched him straight in the face as hard as I could. "Ah!" He stood up with me and crushed me against his chest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. And I felt my shoulders were about to snap. He slopped out of the swamp and walked sideways with me up the embankment, his shoes wheezing and him spitting at the ground. He kept me squeezed so tight I couldn't even think over the pain. When we got back to the embankment, the constable paused for a few seconds and caught his breath. And then he carried me over to the car and dropped one arm to pull open the door handle. With the pressure off me, my senses came rushing back, and I spun around and I bit him right on the chest. He yelled and pulled my head from his chest. "Juvenile, center my ass. Jail's more like it, you crazy long-haired little turd." He slapped my deerskin hat from my head, and I saw it roll across the road. I tried to cry out, but I felt weak and dizzy. He opened the door to the police car, and he shoved me in across the back seat and slammed the door. I lay there until I caught my breath and the dizziness went away. When I sat up, I saw the constable standing beside the car with his mud-covered arms out like a scarecrow, cursing and flapping them to fling the mud off of him. He kicked his legs from side to side and slung large chunks of mud off the grass on the road. Then he noticed the black box clipped to his belt. He stopped and stared at it. He gently pulled it loose and shook it. He walked behind the police car and hurled it at the asphalt where it shattered and spread across the highway like little black silver pieces. After almost 10 minutes of pacing and cursing on the side of the road, he threw my things into the trunk. When everything was out of the wheelbarrow, he picked the wheelbarrow up and tossed it over the embankment where it arced and then stuck straight up by the handles in the swamp below. He spit after it, came around and sank into the driver's seat and glanced at me briefly in the rearview mirror. I hope I busted those sunglasses too, I said.